Well, the date today is June 26, 2014, and the sting operatives that are surrounding me right now are being very active. The sting operatives that are renting an apartment down below me, those sting operatives have children, and just about, I would say about 20 minutes ago, they were directing those children to hang out in front of my apartment right here. They were running back and forth like that. And the children were being directed by the adults to dare me to step outside. So they were hanging out right in front of my apartment, and they called me a name, and then they dared me to step outside of my apartment. Now, I didn't go out there to look to see who the hell it was. I already pretty much know who they are. They're the people that are in the apartment directly below. They're the ones responsible. As far as the brats are concerned, I have no idea who the hell they are, but it doesn't matter. I don't hold fault to them. They're just being coached and directed by bad people in law enforcement that are directly below me. So I don't hold fault to them. But they're giving me they're giving me the impression, based on this street theater performance that these adults are directing those poor brats to do, they're giving me the impression that they have every intention of shooting me the moment I step outside. And they're out there right now. I don't know if this thing can pick it up or not, but you can hear adults out there right now talking. And they're the adults that were directing these children to do this. I can just barely hear them. I can't distinguish any words they're saying, but I can distinguish the sound of male adult voices out there. But it's distant, so they're either like inside an apartment near here, or they're over across the courtyard or something, and they're not trying to talk loudly. They might be on the end of the building over here too, possible. But those are the adults. Those are the adults that are directing those brats that are doing this. They're putting on police sting operations. When police target somebody in a sting operation, they take over multiple apartments surrounding their target. Multiple. So they pretty much have my whole apartment surrounded by sting operatives. Some who are undercover law enforcement officers, others who happen to be civilian operatives, and yes, law enforcement recruits civilians as sting operatives. They do it all the time. Oh, you didn't know that? Well, guess what? Your news media lies to you, because the police recruit news reporters also as sting operatives. So what's that tell you? There's a lot of people that lie for police. There's a lot of people that cover for police, and that includes news reporters. Police are free to recruit civilians into sting operations. What that boils down to is they're free to recruit civilians into criminal conspiracies, and there's no limit to the amount of people they can recruit. Therefore, law enforcement usually recruits their buddies and their girlfriends and their relatives as sting operatives. And law enforcement news media, they pal around all the goddamn time. They cover for one another. For all intents and purposes, you can honestly think of every single news reporter in the country as a sting operative, because they all lie for police and cover for police. But anyway, they have my apartment surrounded by sting operatives, and they deliberately and intentionally stage street theater performances, just like they do in a prostitution sting or a drug bust sting. They perform. Literally, they perform. Like if police are doing a prostitution sting, they'll have their female officers and their girlfriends dress up like prostitutes, and they'll act like sluts around their targets so that they can make their targets appear to be Johns, when in fact they're not actually doing anything wrong. The people they're framing are not actually doing anything wrong at all. But see, through the sting operative sheer performance, they can make a person look like a bad guy. Well, it's the same thing with when law enforcement acts like they're drug dealers in a drug busting. It's the same thing. You know, officers will dress up like a drug dealer, and then they fucking pretend they're selling drugs on the street. And anybody they talk to on the streets appears to be a buyer. Now, don't they? Don't they? You know, you don't have to buy anything from those kind of people. You know, you can just talk to them about the weather, and guess what? For their video surveillance, you now look like a bad guy. So see, through their sheer performance alone, they can make a person look like a bad guy. Well, my wife was having an affair with a cop. And that cop was a damn close look-alike to me. He was such a close look-alike that my wife and her family and my wife's coworkers were calling him by the nickname Double Click. And they were doing this because he was literally acting as a double in order to set me up for crimes. In other words, he was staging and or committing crimes, or a combination thereof. And it was open knowledge amongst my wife and her side of the family and my wife's coworkers that my wife was having an affair with this look-alike and that he was acting as a double. And everybody at my wife's place of employment at the time, which was Eastport Walmart, everybody there knew about it. And it was Eastport Walmart employees that coined his nickname. Well, when I discovered this was occurring, I tried to warn people about it, and that's when my wife poisoned me. And I was severely debilitated from being poisoned, severely. And I couldn't walk, I couldn't talk, I couldn't even breathe. I had to manually breathe because it was impossible for me to automatically breathe, which means I wasn't able to sleep because of it. Well, they continued to set me up for crimes while I was debilitated. They continued to frame me for crimes. The police used their power of influence at the hospitals to cover up the poisonings, so I had no way, at any hospital I went to get help. Every single hospital I went to get help refused to take a toxicology test. They refused to take my complaint. They covered up the fact that I reported to them that my wife poisoned me. They covered up any evidence that I surrendered to them and would even refuse to look at any evidence I tried to hand them. And for all intents and purposes, it was a complete denial of emergency services because they refused to help me because of police influence. Well, while I was debilitated and being denied emergency services, my wife and her family and their buddies and lovers in law enforcement were continuing to set me up for crimes. And on March 26, 2007, my wife and her lover and his buddies were setting me up for a murder. And I caught them all in the act on an audio recorder. They broke into my home early in the morning. I was asleep on my couch in the living room. And I awoke at 5:55 a.m. in the morning, hearing what sounded like whispering and sex noises occurring. And hearing what sounded like my wife whispering to a dude and hearing what sounded like a dude whispering back to my wife. And I was under the belief I'm catching my wife and her armed lover, the cop, Officer Harry Carlson, in their affair. I put an audio recorder I had in my wife's purse and I laid back down on the couch and pretended to be asleep, knowing my wife was going to leave for work soon. So my thinking, keep in mind, I just woke up. You know, I didn't have a chance to think clearly. I mean, you wake up and you discover strange people are in your home and that your spouse is having sex with these strange people in your home, what are you going to think? It's like I had no idea that they were actually killing somebody. I had no idea that they did that at this time. And I knew it was almost time for my wife to leave. I put that audio recorder in my wife's purse at around 6 in the morning. And my wife and her buddies in law enforcement that she was having sex with, they left the apartment at 6:14. So like I said, I knew my wife was going to be leaving for work soon. I didn't realize how many people were in the apartment yet, and I didn't even realize what fully they were doing yet. That's the reason I put the audio recorder in her purse. I didn't know what's going on. I had reason to believe she was having sex with her lover, the cop, but I didn't know what else they were doing or involved in. So I put an audio recorder in my wife's purse, so I could prove their affair, even though she already admitted to her affair. I wanted to prove their ongoing affair because she claimed her affair was over. I knew it wasn't. And I saw this as a chance to not only prove that their affair was still going on, but to prove that they were in my home. And these people committed a murder. There was more than one male officer that was in our home that morning. There was Officer Eric Carlson of the Portland Police, and there was an Officer John Ray. They were both in our home with my wife, and they were with our youngest daughter. And they were all in our daughter's room at the time. I didn't realize that until after I put the audio recorder in my wife's purse and laid back down on the couch. Because as soon as I laid back down on the couch, that's when they all came out of our daughter's bedroom, and they all went into my wife's bedroom. And my wife and my wife and her lovers in law enforcement, they went from our daughter's bedroom to my wife's bedroom, and they were all in there whispering and shit, and I couldn't hear what they're saying, but I could hear them whispering. And so I knew they were trying to conceal the fact that they were in our home. They're trying to be quiet, they're trying to be secretive, they're trying not to wake me up. At that point, I knew everybody in the apartment was already awake, because like I said, they just came from our daughter's room, and then they all went into my wife's room. So I knew they all were awake. So the only reason they're whispering is because they're trying to hide it from me. Now, I already know these people are in law enforcement. I already knew that. As a matter of fact, my wife admitted that Officer Eric Carlson was a cop about a week before they broke into my home. Of course, I knew he was a cop anyway, but my wife literally admitted he was a cop a week before they broke into my home. So I had no intention of confronting them. Why would I confront my wife and her lover, the armed cop, when they break into my home? Why? That would, that makes no sense at all. I had every reason to believe foul play, some form of foul play was going on. I didn't realize that they were targeting somebody else or that they harmed somebody else. I had no idea. But my audio recorder was running, and it was catching everything they're saying and everything they're doing, and they committed a murder. It wasn't just Officer Eric Carlson and Officer John Ray that broke into my home. They had some female with them that also broke in with them, and they were all performing various you-know-what type of deeds in a bedroom, and they murdered this female person. And this Officer John Ray carried that person's body out the window. They didn't even care. They didn't even care. And there was more people involved than just them. there were at least 3 different female officers that were also involved that were on the outside of the apartment, and they were using photogenic cameras. And the reason they were doing this was because Officer Eric Carlson was dressed like me. He broke into my home and was impersonating me, and he was posing for photogenic photos, while his partner, Officer John Ray, from the inside of the apartment, takes photogenic photos from the inside of the apartment of Officer Eric Carlson acting as a double. These female officers that were outside of the apartment were snapping photogenic photos from the outside in, and of Officer Eric Carlson. So they were documenting the crimes that Officer Eric Carlson was committing while he was acting as a double of me. Now, I didn't realize this was occurring at the time, but I suspected something of this nature because I already knew he's a lookalike. I already knew he was having an affair with my wife. I already knew why everybody was calling him by the nickname Double Click. So I had every reason to suspect some form of foul play. Well, after they killed this person, my wife and her lover began planting evidence in my apartment, and they were doing this in between 6 and 6:14 a.m. They were trying to be very quiet about it, and they were even doing this in the living room where I was, and I was on the couch asleep, or not asleep. They think I'm asleep, but I'm wide awake and listening and fully cognizant of the fact that my wife's armed buddies in law enforcement were illegally in my home and that they were trying to hide it. I was very cognizant of that. As a matter of fact, if I'd have made it known at that moment that I was awake, they would have probably just shot me right then and there. So I had every reason to fear for my life. At that point, and I remained motionless and acted like I was asleep, in fear that I would be shot by these murderers. My audio recorder is still in my wife's purse. It's still running. It's still recording, the audio of what was going on in that home, and it caught them sneaking, or it caught them in their whispering to one another. It caught it even, you could even distinguish on the audio recorder what they're saying to one another and stuff. As it was happening, I couldn't distinguish what they were saying because of the manner in which I was laying down, because I'm laying down on my pillow on the couch, so it was very difficult for me to actually hear what they were whispering to one another. But the audio recorder caught it very well, and my wife booted up our computer, and she was putting pornographic photos and shit on our damn computer. And she's only like several feet away from me when she did this. She thinks I'm still asleep on the couch. So they're trying to be quiet. They're not talking out loud or anything. She's trying to be quiet, but I could hear her booting up the computer, and I could hear her sliding what sounded like a USB stick or a flash card or something like that into the computer. And she was only on the computer once it got booted up. She was only on the computer for about a minute, and I did hear Officer Eric Carlson whisper to her to copy. So he was whispering to her instructions as to what to do. So she copied something onto the computer. I didn't know what they were doing on the computer at the time, but I could hear. She's only like several feet away from me, and I could hear her booting. She's sitting at the computer. She's booting it up, and she's inserted either a USB stick or a flash card or something into the computer, because I can hear that noise. That's a very distinguishable noise, So I knew that she did something of that nature. And I didn't know at the time what she was doing. She was putting pornographic photos on the computer. When she got done doing this, both She left the computer on, by the way. Very crucial, vital information right there. She left the computer on. She didn't shut it. She didn't shut it back off. My wife and her lover sneaked past me, and they both went into the kitchen. And my wife opened the patio shade. And then from that point forward, my wife and her lover were in the kitchen. And my wife was pointing out to her lover, Officer Eric Carlson, which cup was my cup. She was telling him, which coffee cup of mine do I use? And she was whispering that to him. And my wife and her lover was poisoning our coffee pot, and they did something with my coffee cup. And when they got done with this, it didn't last very long. It lasted about probably 2 minutes max. 2 minutes. And when they got done poisoning that thing, my wife closed the patio shade, and then she picked up her purse, and then both Officer Eric Carlson and my wife Joan Wager walked past me, and they went out the front door together. And they weren't trying really at that moment to be quiet. As soon as Officer Eric Carlson got out the door, my wife wasn't worried about being quiet anymore. So she wasn't trying to be quiet when she shut the door. Once my wife and her lover got outside, they started talking to this Officer John Ray and to these other female officers that were involved, and they immediately started talking about what they just did. Now keep in mind, my audio recorder is in my wife's purse and it's running. So everything that they just did, they're talking about, and my audio recorder is catching it. And the reason I didn't find out until my wife got to work why she opened and closed the patio shade. I didn't find out until after I got that audio recorder back why she opened and closed the patio shade. I knew she did it, but I didn't know why. You know, I'm in the living room. I could hear her opening the patio shade, and then they messed around with my coffee pot and my coffee cup. And then when they got done with that, they closed the patio shade. Now, I didn't know why she did that at the time, but my audio recorder caught the reason why. And the reason why was because there was at least two female officers that were outside of the apartment that were taking photogenic photos of Officer Eric Carlson while he impersonates me. So not only were they in our bedrooms framing me as a pedo, and they had female volunteers for that, they had that double in our kitchen, and he was poisoning my coffee pot. So they're trying to frame me for their crimes, and I caught them in the act of committing these crimes and setting me up. The audio recorder is literally catching them. The audio recorder I put in my wife's purse is catching them in the act of committing these crimes, and it's catching them immediately discussing what they just did right after they set foot outside. And they had they didn't leave right away. They went out into the parking lot, and they were out in the parking lot for about 5 to 6 minutes, talking to one another briefly about what they all just did. Basically, they're all getting their story straight. And they're not whispering anymore, but they're still talking in a hushed tone. So they're right out. They stepped outside of my apartment, and they're still talking in a hushed tone. And they admitted that they poisoned me. My wife admitted that she planted poison in our home. And she was telling a female officer this, and the female officer was saying, "Good." So, they were discussing what they just did. Okay? And my wife and all these officers got in their vehicles, and they all headed straight to Clackamas Walmart. And my wife was working at Clackamas Walmart in March 26, 2007. She transferred from Eastport Walmart to Clackamas Walmart in mid-2006. basically right after she wrote her diary, and then she wrote her infamous denial letter right after that. Shortly after that, that's when she transferred from Eastport Walmart to Clackamas Walmart. So my wife and all these people in law enforcement, mostly female people in law enforcement, there was 2 male members in law enforcement involved in this at the time, that were directly, actively involved. There were more people that were indirectly involved, and I'll get to that in a second. They all got in their vehicles and they all headed straight to Clackamas Walmart. Well, on a drive to Clackamas Walmart, my wife and her lover, Officer Eric Carlson, were discussing the person they murdered. And Officer Eric Carlson was asking my wife for help in regards to the person they murdered. And they named that person. And they admitted to other things. On the drive to Walmart, my wife and her lover, Officer Eric Carlson, were fooling around with each other on the drive to Clackamas Walmart. So they were sort of celebrating what they just got done doing a little bit. And my wife, Joan Wager, was telling Officer Eric Carlson, they started talking about the fact that they're getting a arrest warrant for my arrest. They were discussing that, and my wife was telling Officer Eric Carlson, for asking Eric Carlson for him and his partner Erica, which is one of the female officers that was outside of our apartment. My wife was asking her lover for him and for that female officer to wait for her to go home because she wanted to be there when the police kicked down my door and arrested me for the charges they framed me for. She wanted to be there for it. So this is what they were discussing on a drive to Clackamas Walmart. Yeah. When they got to Clackamas Walmart, my wife's sister, Vicki Rosales, was waiting for them in the parking lot at Clackamas Walmart, and my wife literally parked pretty much right next to wherever Vicki Rosales was parked. And as soon as she parked and turned off the vehicle, she's immediately talking to her sister Vicki Rosales, because she's like right there. My wife and her sister Vicki Rosales both worked at Clackamas Walmart, and they start making cutesy talk and shit. They're in celebration mode at this point. My wife's sister already knew about their plan to set me up, so my wife and her lover was essentially making it known to Vicki Rosales how it all went, because she already knew about it. So, and they're pretty much in celebration mode at this point. By the time my wife and her lover and his partners in authority get to Clackamas Walmart, they're all in celebration mode, and they're pretty much freely talking about what they just did, and they're basically explaining to Vicki Rosales what they all just did and how they did it. And they're pretty much laughing about it, and they're cracking jokes about it, and they're in a very good mood about it, and all this kind of shit. Like I said, they're in celebration mode. Literally, they're in celebration mode at this point. And they pretty much admitted that they were framing me as a pedo. Officer John Ray said that out loud. He literally said it out loud. And they proceeded to describe to Vicki Rosales how they did it, and they were talking about how they were using Eric Carlson as a double. They admitted that Eric Carlson was in our daughter's room and that he was posing for photogenic photos, and they got pictures of his you-know-what while he was in there. And the whole time they're laughing, they're in celebrate. Keep in mind, they're not being discreet, they're not being quiet at this point. They're being quite loud, very vocal, and they're in a celebration mood. So they're not really trying to be quiet while they're doing this. And there was it's a large group of several people, that some of whom I can identify, not because I know who they are, but because they're saying their names. So based on the names that I've heard them say, there was a black female that was named Adrian. There was a white female named Erica. There was, of course, my wife, Joan Wager. There was my wife's sister, Vicky Rosales. There was my wife's lover, Officer Eric Carlson, and one of his partners named Officer John Ray. And those were the people that were they were all in the front lobby at Clackamas Walmart having this discussion. And it was a celebration type of a discussion where they're celebrating what they just did. And they're describing to Vicky Rosales what they did, essentially. And they're celebrating while they're doing it. And they're telling her how they did it, and they're telling her how they were setting me up. And they told her they planted evidence in my home. They told her that they They told her that they poisoned my coffee pot, and my wife chimed in on that in a cheery mood and admitted that she helped with that. And they admitted they got it all in photogenic photos. And it was during this time, while they're getting to that part of their explanation to Vicky Rosales, that a couple of higher up detectives arrived, and the first thing they said is, "So you got them for us." And the female officer named Erica, spoke up, and she admitted that they got it all in photogenic. So at this point, I'm discovering that there's at least two other male detectives that were involved that apparently these officers report to and take orders from, because these detectives ordered these officers to make those photogenic photos using a double. And it was these detectives that arrived to pick up the photos. And it's at this point they admitted that our home was under illegal video surveillance. They're admitting our home was under video surveillance, and that they wanted 630 taken off of the video surveillance. And they admitted to that. And the detective that apparently is their superior is asking why. And they admitted because John Ray broke it. They used John Ray breaking into my home as their excuse to have that part of that segment of the video surveillance erased. Well, it's between 6 and 6:14 that they committed a murder. They carried a body out of the home. They fucking planted evidence in my home, and they poisoned my coffee pot. So that's the section of their video surveillance they want erased. Well, my audio recorder is still running in my wife's purse and is catching all of this. So not only are they admitting to their crimes, they're admitting they're trying to cover their asses, and they're trying to give me the blame. They're admitting to that. It was at this point when the front doors to Clackamas Walmart were unlocked so that Walmart employees could enter the store to go to work. My wife, Joan Wager, and Vicky Rosales being two of those employees. And they all pretty much filed into the store, with the exception of The male officers stayed outside, while all the females involved in this operation went into the store and went into the back of the store. Officer Eric Carlson, Officer John Ray, and these other male detectives that showed up to pick up what they made, they stayed outside. While all the females involved in this, they all went inside the store and headed straight to the back of the store and towards the break room. And when my wife and her sister got into the back of the store, they immediately put on a pretend show for their co-workers at Clackamas Walmart, they were pretending that Officer Eric Carlson hasn't arrived yet. And that was the first thing they did as soon as they got in the back of the store. They immediately gave the Walmart employees the impression that they're waiting for Officer Eric Carlson to arrive, because they didn't want Walmart employees to know that they arrived at Clackamas Walmart with Officer Eric Carlson. So they're trying to give Walmart employees the impression that he's not there yet. It's during this time that these male officers were getting rid of the body or dealing with the body that they had. And my wife and her sister and these other female officers were covering for them and pretending that Officer Eric Carlson hasn't arrived yet. So they're trying to give these male officers an alibi. They're fabricating right on the spot an alibi for them. And when I would say about 10 minutes after my wife and her sister got into the break room, that's when Officer Eric Carlson made his magical appearance as though he just arrived. And my wife was faking and pretending to be happy to see him, and as though she was acting as though she hasn't seen him in years. And they're pretending like it's a long lost meeting of theirs, and they're each saying to each other they love each other and all this shit. And everybody in the break room started applauding them, and because they're putting on a bullshit show for Walmart employees. And but it didn't take long for them to cease their bullshit put on show, and they all started cracking jokes about how easy it was for Officer Eric Carlson to impersonate me, and that everybody in that store, at least in that break room at that time, knew I was being framed by Officer Eric Carlson. Officer Eric Carlson was still dressed like me. He still looked like me. His hair was dyed like mine, and they were all cracking jokes about how he's dressed like me, and they were literally making it known that to everybody in that store that they were setting me up. I don't think anybody, based on what I heard on that audio recording, I'm under the impression that most everybody in that store did not know these people committed a murder. I'm under the impression that these officers and my wife and anybody else that was directly involved in this were trying to conceal that fact from them. But they weren't trying to conceal the fact that they were setting me up. That was open knowledge. In other words, everybody in that store knew that Officer Eric Carlson was a lookalike to me. They all knew his hair was dyed when he showed up in the back of that store that morning, because he's a natural brunette. I'm a natural blonde. He's a natural brunette. And he showed up in that store dressed like me and appeared to be me. He had blonde hair. He was dressed like me. And they're all cracking freaking jokes about it. And a Walmart employee at one point asked Officer Eric Carlson, "What was your name again?" And Officer Eric Carlson and my wife's sister, Vicky Rosales, spoke up at the same time saying, "Eric." And then my wife, as a joke, chimed in a sheepish manner. She said, "Terry." and they all broke out laughing. The whole break room, everybody that was in that break room, broke out laughing at this. So this was open knowledge at Clackamas Walmart that my wife was having an affair with a cop, and that he's acting as a double, and that he's setting me up as a pedo. Now, and they spent the next 3 hours that morning, these officers and my wife and her sister, they spent the next 3 hours doing 3 different things, basically. They were partying and celebrating and flaunting it. They were flaunting that. And they were recruiting people at Clackamas Walmart to lie for them. And they were printing flyers giving me the blame for their crimes. And by 9:30 that morning, they pretty much had everybody in the clothing department and the shoes department to lie for them. Everybody in the clothing department and everybody in the shoes department that morning agreed to lie for them. Now that's the morning shift, and those two departments in that store is departments that my wife Joan Wager and her sister Vicki Rosales work. My wife worked in the clothing department. Her sister worked in the shoes department. And that was around 9:30. That's about the time they got done printing the flyers that they were printing, setting me up, giving me the blame for their crimes. And it was at this point there was an officer. It was either Erica or Adrian. I don't know which. They were too far away. They were too far away from my wife's purse for me to be 100% certain as to which one said it. But it was one of those female officers that was telling a female superior of theirs that they got everybody in the soft lines department to agree to lie for them. And the soft lines department consists of the clothing department and the shoes department. And it was at this point that this female superior walked up to my wife, and my wife was right by her locker where her purse was, and my wife was just putting a huge stack of flyers in her locker on top of her purse where my audio recorder was running. This superior officer walked up to my wife, and she asked my wife if she's ready to murder me now. And I'm going to have to presume that my wife nodded yes, because there was no verbal answer from my wife. So they spent the remainder of that day, my wife and her lover spent the remainder of that day partying, celebrating in the back of that store. My wife and her lover were having sex around 10:45 a.m. that morning in the back of that store someplace. And when the afternoon shift came in, my wife and her lover and a couple other officers were in the back of that store recruiting the afternoon shift to lie for them. So by around 1 o'clock in the afternoon, they pretty much had everybody in that store involved to one degree or another degree. Now, I'm under the belief that most of them just didn't take any active part in this, but simply agreed to lie for them, to cover for them. Does that make sense? In other words, I don't think most of them actually committed a crime, but because of police influence and police pressure, all of them literally agreed to lie for them and to cover for them. Now, I'm pretty darn sure that some of them made that agreement simply based on the fact that, well, gee, their coworkers are joining into it. Maybe they better join into it too, or they'll become targeted by it. So I'm sure a lot of people just agreed just because of peer pressure kind of a thing. Some Walmart employees were actually giving my wife and her lover tips as to how to set me up. And my wife and her lover, Officer Eric Carlson, was asking the afternoon shift of employees for tips as to how to set me up. And so it was their way of recruiting the afternoon shift into this stuff. And my audio recorder caught some of the Walmart employees giving them some tips. They were telling my wife to put incriminating looking phone numbers in my cell phone contact list, things like that. That's an example. That's one of the examples right there that's an actual example of one of the tips a Walmart employee that I have no idea who this person is, but it's a Walmart employee in their break room, and was giving my wife and her lover this tip. So it was law enforcement's way of recruiting. It was my wife and her buddies in authority. It was their way of recruiting them into it, and they wanted them to feel like they're a part of it. So they were asking for tips and stuff like that as to how to make me look like a bad guy. Now they vilified me behind my back. They had me debilitated. They poisoned me. They had me debilitated. I couldn't go anywhere, and they vilified me. They spent literally a couple years, vilifying me behind my back so that nobody would care that I'm a victim. So it was just it kind of became a situation where they all see it as, well, he's going to die anyway. Let's just, let's help them out and cover for them, blah, 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 that kind of a thing. So a lot of people joined into it but are not necessarily guilty of an actual crime. In a lot of ways, I don't fault a lot of the Walmart employees that joined into this, that agreed to life for them anyway. I don't necessarily fault most of them because based on what I heard on that audio recording, there was a lot of pressuring going on, undue pressuring going on by law enforcement. So a lot of those Walmart employees were kind of put in a situation by law enforcement where law enforcement's making it known that they better lie for them or else, kind of a thing. So I don't really want to fault Walmart employees for this based on what I heard on that audio recording. There were some that were fully helping them, all gung-ho about helping them set me up and stuff that are definitely, should be deemed guilty. But based on what I heard on the audio recording, I would have to assume the vast majority of people joined into it just because they were pressured into it and felt like they would probably be targeted by these people if they didn't. They would be singled out. So I want that, on the record. I don't think most of them are actually deserving to be, charged or labeled guilty of anything, because based on what I heard on the audio recording, there was a lot of pressuring going on, and I'm sure quite a few of those people joined into it just because they felt like they'd be targeted by those people if they didn't. So for that reason, I don't think most of the people in Walmart are actually necessarily guilty. If anything, they were pressured into it. So the actual crimes that were being committed were the crimes that my wife were committing and her buddies in authority were committing, and they simply recruited a lot of people to back up their lies, essentially, and of which a lot of people agreed to do down there. And I also want to point out, based on what I heard on that audio recording, that yes, they were admitting to murders. It was when my wife and her lover were celebrating that morning in the back of that store. They were both having sex. My wife and her lover were having sex, and they were discussing well, during their sex, they were discussing the female they murdered. So I know they fucking committed a murder. They committed a murder, and based on everything that I heard on the audio recording, they were hush hush about that to any of the Walmart employees there. And they never made mention to the other Walmart employees that they killed somebody. So I'm under the belief that most Clackamas Walmart employees are unaware that these officers committed a murder. They knew I'm being framed as a pedo, and they were under the belief that Eric Carlson was. They knew Eric Carlson was acting as a double. They knew that. They knew he was staging crimes, acting as a double. I don't think they knew he committed an actual murder. I don't think that was known by them, based on what I heard on that audio recording. Now I could be wrong on that, but based on that particular day, based on what that audio recorder caught, I'm under the impression that most of the Walmart employees there are unaware that these officers committed a murder. My wife, Joan Wager, and this black female officer named Adrian, they're the officers that were printing the flyers, and they were using Clackamas Walmart office printers to print those flyers, and they were giving me the blame for the crimes they just committed and staged that morning. And everybody at Clackamas Walmart knew I was being framed. It was open knowledge in the back of that store and was openly discussed. They even talked about how they take back shots and side shots of Eric Carlson while he's dressed like me. So they always talk in terms of photogenic photos when they use doubles. They don't like to use video surveillance when they use doubles. They like to use photogenic photos, and they talk about side shots and they talk about back shots. And that's what they were talking about. And so I'm basically, explaining why I'm a victim of a conspiracy here, and I am very much surrounded by sting operatives right now that do not want me as a witness, and they have been pedifying me in this neighborhood, and they do it in preparation of shooting me. They always kill people they pedify. The Portland Police and the Multnomah County Sheriffs have a history of pedifying. They murder people they pedify. They're not really hiding it, the fact that they're doing it. And I know the department manager here is friends with these people and is assisting these people in pedifying me here at this place where I live right now. I'm expecting to be shot soon because of their actions, which is indicating they're indicating their intent of doing that. They're intentionally making it known. Well, I'm just going to end this here. We'll see what happens.